Welcome to a Shot in the Arm podcast. I'm your host, Ben Plumley. So, a couple of years ago, we did a set of episodes in Nairobi, Kenya and Lagos, Nigeria, asking how teenage girls and boys and young women and men were coping coming out of the COVID lockdowns. Away from the fear of a new global pandemic, the excitement of new mRNA vaccines was a theme common to both cities. That boys are being left behind in education, in life skills, in economic opportunities, making them ripe for the so-called hypertoxic masculinity influencers waiting for them online. I've stayed in touch with one of the friends of the pod who did a couple of thought-provoking episodes back then, and he's back to kick my old English arse as we discuss and explore what it means to be a 21st century man and where we go from here. It's an honour, yea, indeed a privilege, to welcome back musician, DJ, podcaster, celebrity influencer, and all-round good guy, Mr. Anton NeoSoul. Welcome back to the pod, Anto. How are you doing?
I'm good, man. Thank you so much for having me, Ben. It's such a great pleasure and honor to be with you again, and I can't wait to get into the conversation, the meat of today's conversation, man. I'm excited.
I know it's something that you've been reflecting on for a good while, and indeed you've been talking very publicly about how young men, and I obviously include you in that. I'm sadly a little bit older. I've been a teenager many, many more times, but how young men take what's going on in the world and forge it into a positive, optimistic sense of masculinity. And I just wanted to kick off where you thought we are in the world and whether you feel optimistic or whether you feel perhaps a bit concerned about where we stand.
Yeah, it's been quite an interesting journey for me, having worked in media and being a part, especially of a really big conversation and a big event called Man Cave, where, a lot of the conversations we've been having really is about trying to understand, how do we define masculinity, and is it even important in terms of how we define it ourselves anymore? And I think for me, the question I've been asking myself is whose definition really counts? When I look at masculinity and I look at the lens that I've seen masculinity through seeing my grandfather alive and being lucky enough to be living around him whilst seeing his masculinity and sort of trying to understand and define how I viewed him as a very stern, silent, very strict man, and then seeing that through my father and also again viewing masculinity through that POV of my father and seeing him working hard, and also what it does to men when, for example, they're laid off from work and sort of take a role that is not seen as being masculine anymore, and also seeing that POV again from my perspective and my generational perspective, and how some of the gender roles have been really sort of changed, and because of just the realities that we live in as a Kenyan. So for me, it's been quite an interesting conversation. And when I look now, for example, at the Gen Zs and how I view masculinity through their lens, it's another complete different ballgame. So it really leads me to ask the question: is it important? Is masculinity important in terms of how we define ourselves anymore? And like I asked again, whose definition counts? And I think for me, it's an ongoing conversation as to what does it mean anymore? Is it personal? Is it communal? Is it important?
And I think it's all of those things. As we were preparing for this podcast, and hopefully a few more that we'll do to expand the conversation, I was struck that despite our different ages, our different cultures, and admittedly I come from a United Kingdom, a Great Britain that was the colonizer of Kenya and all the damage that did to the society in Kenya, and indeed to the United Kingdom, actually. Yeah. I was struck, yes, of course, by the differences, but by the commonalities. Mm-hmm. And the way that you described your grandfather, silent, perhaps distant, but a strong sense of duty and expectations of how people should behave, how men should behave, that completely resonates with me. And I think it would be really great for us to just sort of kick off and describe how we ourselves, how you and I think about masculinity. And if I kick it off after your introduction, for me, it's all about duty. It is about sacrifice. It is about honor. It is about privilege. I think I describe myself as being educated in the upper middle class English public school system, which of course is a private school, naturally, but being prepared to run the Imperial Civil Service in the 1930s. And of course, I was educated in the 1980s. So I came out in a world that was entirely unprepared, passed on, moved on from what I had been educated to be. So for me, that was then very confusing. So applying that sense of duty, that sense of responsibility throughout my life and my career has sometimes been very challenging. What's it been like for you?
I think for me, one of the things that I've really been questioning is, just the roots of our masculinity. I mean, where does all this come from? How we speak, how we dress, how we carry ourselves. I mean, I think it's a constant question that, as a millennial, that we're constantly asking ourselves, what does it mean to be a man? What should I stand for? When I look at sort of, and I'll get to the point of my masculinity, is I look at it from explicitly what I have seen growing up, that is the usual, be a man. Just you need to be a man. This is how men are. This is what men don't whine and grovel. This is, you take it, just stand upright. That's what I have seen explicitly, but also implicitly observing fathers, my uncles, my grandfather. And so from a Kenyan context, I really see masculinity for me as, defined through the traditional roles that, and like you said, a sense of duty that is instilled upon me, and that is to be a provider, being a stoic leader. So you must lead, but there's also a sense of stoicism, that you roll with the punches. And also, I also view it again from the lens of colonial and post-colonial influences, when I look at respectability politics and religion and how that comes into play. But then also for me, when I look at masculinity also, I then have to also look at the urban versus rural divide that is there, and the kind of masculine male figure that I see myself as an urbanite is very different from one that is from a rural sort of background. And so for me, it's nothing specifically cast in stone, but it's more of, I look at it from a point of the background that I come from and my present, and how the present realities are defining how I carry myself as a man. But then also look at it from a legacy point of view. What do I leave for the future, and how does that look like? And so those specific structures have really defined my masculinity. But also for me, because of the work that I do, and because of my activism and what I stand for, and also having grown up and having very influential and powerful women leading our families, and also from my cultural background, I also have to look at masculinity and the gender equity and the conversation around that. And so again, looking at how do I reconcile heritage masculinity with equity for women. So the tension that comes from being a Kenyan, from just the progress that comes with that, and the backlash also around that. And I mean, it also comes from my work as a musician, as being on radio, and, being seen as fighting for women's rights, and how that is seen as sort of trying to erase men, and playing a role in not really elevating the men more. So I mean, for me, masculinity, it is such a nuanced conversation that I'm still on the journey of understanding what does it mean to be masculine.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I am very much still on that journey. If you look back at your life, which male influences deeply affected you, deeply informed your sense of your own masculinity? Does anyone stand out?
I think, I mean, it's interesting because there's certain men in my life who, I look up to, and I sort of, in terms of seeing their characters and their behaviors and what they stood for, but then also they for me, I was also picky on what I also liked. I look at my paternal grandfather, because I didn't have the privilege to get to meet my maternal grandfather. So my paternal grandfather was quite interesting because he commanded attention and respect without having to say a word. And that, for me, I found so riveting. I found it so interesting. I think it also comes with my intrinsically sort of my DNA as being dramatic. I found that so it was just, this is so cool. Like, this dude is just sitting there outside his patio and veranda, and when you see him, everybody walks in a different direction, and there's also the toxicity that comes from that, but I love that. I love that he commanded that sort of attention, and when I would see him in public places, but then also there was a lot of wisdom. He oozed so much wisdom that when he spoke, it was so difficult for anybody, his peers, who was also, again, lucky to sort of see them growing around him, and also anybody else from my elder uncles, to really question him, and not out of a sense of just fear and respect, but also that he got a lot of things right. And so I was lucky to sort of see that, but also to see how much he loved reading and how much he respected everybody, regardless of their age. And so for me, that was quite interesting to sort of see that and see how he mellowed with age and he graced, with age, but the respect still remained. But also when I look at from my mom's side, I have an uncle of mine. He's called Balobi. Balobi is actually a Congolese name, and he got the name because he was quite an amazing Congolese musician, singer, with a music called Lingala. But then also just his love of life and living out loud, and he loved boxing, and I was very young when he introduced me to alcohol. When I mean young, I mean like 11 years old, and he made me sip alcohol, and he also had my brother imbibe in alcohol, and we were not of age, but my brother got really high, and he was actually completely he was vomiting and stuff, but I was a bit tipsy, and I was 11 years old. And so I also remember him. I think my first time to see a gun and actually touch a gun was through him. And I mean, all these things were quite illegalities that he actually made me get to experience. Yeah. But then again, that, sort of getting to experience that side of masculinity, that when I look at my dad, his was very, very protective. It was that you don't indulge in illegalities. You don't indulge in what I have not taught you. You don't do what's wrong. You only follow the book, and you follow the rules, and stickler for rules. Well, here's my uncle telling me, throw that out of the way and just do whatever the hell I want you to do. So for me, those influences was so interesting to watch and to see. And even for me, what was also interesting was to see my dad and his friends around him, and how he became a completely different person around his friends, and how he was happy and joyful and playful and fun. And so seeing that was something I looked up to and said, for me, I've always said that I wanted to experience all sides of the coin. So the fun and playful side, the really stoic, but also I want to be seen in society as someone who is respectable, but also respectful of other people.
I think you have a richer, more developed sense of masculinity than I do. There's some of what you described that really resonates with me.
Why?
So if I look at if I look at who influenced me, and remember, I was at boarding school from a very early age. I have 2 left feet. I'm not particularly physically, adroit.
Yeah.
But I found solace or comfort or even interest in literature, and particularly the English writer Aldous Huxley. And I know that a number of my friends will roll their eyes when they hear that. But here's this tall, angular, very awkward man with virtually no eyesight, who is an extraordinary mystic and visionary. And I just am obsessed from 10, 11 about his literature. And it stood with me really throughout my life. And that provided this sense of distance, of the power of intellect, the power of analysis. And then later on, he got into some sort of mysticism and taking LSD, and that didn't quite relate with me at that time. It does more so now, the mysticism less the LSD. And so that provided a hook for me, but it was very distant. My father, I think, was the other big influence on my life as it relates to defining masculinity. And here's a story.
Yeah.
He was exceptionally distant. I had no idea what he did in his career. I remember that in a maths lesson, the teacher, Lieutenant Commander Owen, a retired naval whatever, said to me, "Plumley, what is it that your father does?" And I couldn't answer.
Wow.
I had no idea. I knew he was a civil servant. And I remembered that he had, perhaps jokingly, said that he had painted the cliffs of Dover white. So I told Lieutenant Commander Owen, "Well, sir, he paints the cliffs of Dover white. Right, detention, Saturday, 2 hours, don't be so cheeky."
Wow.
And it's only in later years that my sister and I have come to understand that he was an intelligence officer for MI6.
Wow.
And couldn't tell you much more about that, what he did, how he developed his career, what happened. But I only now understand that sense of absolute commitment to duty, absolute commitment to service, and discretion being, I think, really central to the way he lives his life. That has really, I think, been a foundation stone for me.
Yeah. I mean, that's so interesting. I mean, imagine living your whole life. That is so interesting. Imagine living your whole life and not knowing what your dad does. And yet he does something so cool that as a boy, as a man, I mean, it would literally, it would shape your destiny in the sense that, I mean, you sort of get some street cred, but then also there's a secrecy that comes in. But also, it really also makes me look at your dad's sort of work. It brings to the core something else about, about sort of traits that also come with sort of the masculinity that we've sort of looked at or looked up to. And a lot of that is suppression, and it's whether it's emotional suppression or just the fact that a lot of these men, older men, just did not speak about the things that, for example, really for me mattered. When we look at something like mental health now, and the concept of anxiety, of ADD, of ADHD, of mental wellness, mental health never occurred ever growing up. And even just as a concept, I mean, leave that alone, but just the idea of speaking. It was always, like you mentioned, it was either for instilling responsibility in you, or duty, or enforcing their rules or their disciplinarian sort of. But there was never a conversation around how did you feel. I never heard my dad speak to anybody or hear him say how he felt or how his day was. I don't remember a day where my dad came home and told us how his day was. When I think about it, I'm like, wow, I knew what he did.
Wow, yeah.
What he did, but I didn't know how he felt.
So, expanding it a bit, Anto, here we are in the middle of the third decade of the 21st century.
Yeah.
You and I passionately committed to continuing to evolve gender norms. So there is equity in relationships. There is equity in opportunity. And I wonder how we get there. I'm struck by a comment that the British podcaster and journalist Emily Maitlis made in an episode where she was covering that new Netflix series, Adolescence. And it was along the lines of, geez, we've got to start thinking about men now. Well, we've only just begun thinking about the needs of girls and women. Come on. And so I'm really interested in how we take what we agree is needed to build equity, but from the lens And it's our responsibility to do this as men, as purveyors of masculinity.
Yeah.
How do you feel that works?
I think for me, one of the biggest issues I've had with this conversation around, we have so much that we're dealing with when it comes to women and girls, and we've forgotten about the men. I think my biggest sort of angst with that conversation is the fact that as men, we have the agency. We can hold agency for other men. Is that we can hold space for other men. Is that nothing is stopping men of influence and affluence to put in the same work to be able to hoist and to teach and to mentor young boys and men. So for me, I think we are so concerned about, comparative politics of gender as to, women have had there's programs for women, and there's all these lords and ladies and sirs and influential men, and chiefs and whatever, who are doing so much for women and organizations, but we're not doing enough for men. But my question is always, what are you doing as a man for men? And so for me, it's to really, I don't believe there's a specific global framework that we can sit around and say that let's write it down. I think for me the thing is to begin to participate. That this global framework, this conversation can only happen. You and I don't have the answers, but we can hold space and agency for the answers to begin to start being looked at. So a boy's experience in London, in Reading, in the UK, and a boy's experience in Kinangop, in Kenya, they're universal, but they're not homogeneous in terms of what is really happening. So we need to have these conversations, and we need to have these kind of conversations that are about positive masculinity, that are about let us understand this jigsaw and this puzzle to be able to say that as men we can stand and support young men. What programs can we begin to start to have? What podcasts can the young men begin to listen to? What are the issues that the young men are going through? How can we begin to support them in those areas? How do we go to the schools and speak to the men? What do they need? What are their needs? What do they want? What are they struggling with in terms of identity, in terms of sexuality, in terms of economically, psychologically? What are these things what are the tools that we can be able to support them with to be able to hold these men to a standard that they can be able to live up to? Whilst the conversation that we are having a lot of times is that women are getting, it's very divisive, it's very divisive politics, it's very comparative, that they're getting the support, that they're getting the funding, they're getting the programming, and the men are not, whilst we are not putting in the work. And so what we have now, we then have a lot of programming, a lot of podcasts, a lot of platforms whose job is to grovel, is to make noise, is to beat and to make women look bad, that they're getting too much, and this is why men should ignore them, and they are a lesser species than we are, so why do we allow them to get all this support? And that, for me, runs away from what it means to be masculine, runs away from what it means to be a man, which is to look at your problem, to define the problem, to commune around the problem, and to find solutions around this problem. And so, and that's one of the reasons why we have, I know it's a conversation we'll have later, but it's one of the reasons why we have a lot of these outbursts, and I think, for me, pockets of intelligent poverty, if I may call it.
Where poverty of intelligence.
Yeah, so poverty intelligence, where a lot of these Andrew Tates are being born, and his offsprings are all over. People believe, including Trump, that the more aggressive and negative and toxic you are, the more masculine you are. And so instead of searching for identity and respect for identity and respect for the physical person and the lived realities, we're now looking for these communal online identities whose DNA and whose existence exists in anti-femininity. And for me, that is a huge problem that I really see.
Now, there's something you said in that I think captures the problem. We haven't as societies around the world, as we have started looking after the rise of feminism, we haven't thought about what the role of men is in this. And to many senses, we have just said, butt out, create space for girls and women to grow and flourish. And I actually really support that. I think that's absolutely right. But as men, we haven't stepped in to create, well, in that environment where we are equals, this is how men and boys act, behave, and this is how we start thinking about flourishing ourselves. And it allows that sort of vacuum, if you like, allows the emergence of this hyper or toxic masculinity that in itself is sort of quite fragile because it's hugely simplistic.
Yep.
Dominate women, be violent to women even. You express your masculinity by how violent you are, how good you are with guns. Whereas, and I want to come back to guns because I think you and I have interesting experiences that go to the idea of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
And I think that in the absence of engaging in conversations as men, our fathers, our influencers, ourselves, and the next generation are ceding the territory to others. I mentioned don't throw the baby out with the bathwater because I think one of the things that has happened in some corners of, say, the gender norms work has been that everything related to masculinity is wrong. Everything that went before is wrong, whether it's the attitudes of our faith leaders, our sport leaders, our politicians, and boy, oh boy, are there problems in all of those areas. Absolutely. But we don't throw that all out. I think there are still positive influences that we can call upon and work with. And that, I think, is a really interesting place where we can begin those conversations. You mentioned Man Cave earlier, and you've done a number of podcasts as well and media, but actually quite serious efforts to start these conversations.
Yeah.
That was a pretty brave step to take for a celebrity like yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an interesting conversation because for me, the thing about masculinity is a journey where you're constantly trying to understand who you are as a man and, defining who you are as a man. Because you look at like I said, you look at the past and the men who've influenced who you are, the man who helped birth you, who basically gave you life. And then you look at your present and the realities around your present. And I look at, and how we are more, there's a word, starting off in the industry, there's, like for me, I'm very fashionable. So there's words that, will come along the way and the rise of the, in the media, things like the rise of the metrosexual and even just the concept of dandyism, and now with the, for example, Gen Z and, some of them they paint their nails and it's literally nothing for us. You look at it and it's obviously because of age, it looks like, and it becomes like a completely foreign concept, but to them it's completely nothing. It's not a conversation that you should have. And so a lot of those things, sort of lead us to say, then how can we bridge this gap? How can we bridge this understanding between men of different generations? Because also the strength that comes with being a man and the ego and and just the standing up for yourself, and it's also one of the it's what really holds us together, but it's also the chain that is broken amongst us. Is that who speaks to who this ego that is, or this sort of dominance that a man has is also the same trait that stops another man from defining my journey as a man. And so therein becomes a challenge as to then how do we grow with each other. And so even being a part of Man Cave, which is, and you know what is so interesting about Man Cave, and this is so interesting, is that the founder of Man Cave is actually a woman. the oxymoron of it all. And so, but for me, hosting 4 of those events so far and being a part of that conversation, and for her, and her name is Bertha, a very close friend of mine. And for her, the reason for, and when you listen to her conversation, the reason for that is because for someone who doesn't have sons, she's got a daughter, is that seeing the men at a workplace, sort of trying to find their voice, and this sort of, again, stoicism of like, you know what, there's no conversation for us and I'm okay with it and I will deal with it, and say, no, but why is it as men you don't want to have this conversation? I think as men you need to have this conversation. And when she looks back at her interaction with very influential men and affluent men in society, and then gets to meet someone like myself, and she sees you as someone who I would like you to meet, this sort of mentor, and not only grow as a man, but also grow as a well-rounded human being. And so for me, these conversations around Man Cave and even around the podcast and challenging, one of the things that I love to challenge is really gender roles. And when you look at, for example, a lot of men who are into caregiving now, and is a role that would not be seen as a role that a man should completely have at all. It's also looking at our relation with money and the economy, and how a lot of men are stuck at home and really taking care of the home, a trait or a role that is seen as for women only. And so those realities for me, is really being able to let us engage, let us confront these realities, because it is the life that we live in today. So but then also, again, looking at traits that we have to challenge. For example, big trait that we have to challenge is emotional suppression. I am such a huge advocate for therapy, for mental health, and for men seeking mental health, and even myself, going to therapy and saying that it's okay and it's allowed, and that men need to seek, and have to confront their demons, so to say, and also looking at and seeing dominance as validation. I think for me, that's also a trait that we have to challenge, that I'm a man, that men, just the idea of I'm a man and I don't treat you can't talk to a man this way. And, I cannot be, a woman cannot be my boss, and I cannot listen to my girlfriend cannot tell me, so those sort of things, and seeing that, no, you cannot validate your bad behavior. You cannot validate your illegalities because of being a man. But then also positive heritage traits to keep, like responsibility and mentorship, that it is okay for you to be responsible, that should push you to study harder, that should push you to be responsible in any capacity that you are in, as long as you do it right. And that is to be mentored and to be a mentee, that you can learn from others, even though that you might be a woman who is of leadership position at your workplace, but you can also, as a man, get to learn from her. That mentorship works both ways. So that for me has been, something that it's very difficult for people to understand. Like I said, a lot of people will see it as trying to erase masculinity. But then I'm like, how do you erase masculinity when you are learning? How is learning about
That's right. That is absolutely right. And if I look at the influencers in my career, all of them really have been women. From my very first job, the CEO of the Human Fertilization Embryology Authority in the UK, Flora Goldhill.
Woman.
Senior UK civil servant, woman. As we're now thinking about gender, perhaps one of the most influential people in my thinking around how to incorporate masculinity in that is Jill Sheffield, the founder of the Women Deliver Conference. And she has always challenged me to think about, it's not just about delivering for women. Delivering for women means delivering for men as well, as lifting us all up in support, ultimately, of women. There is so much that we have to cover, and we're going to have to do more episodes to address this.
Definitely.
There are 2 things in this podcast I really want us to cover.
Yeah.
One is our relationship with guns, with weapons, which is something that is taboo, but also very visceral, I think, in masculinity. And I think we also have to touch a little bit on how we relate to women and the role women play in our lives. But on guns,
Yeah.
you mentioned that your uncle showed you and helped you touch a gun at a very young age.
Yeah.
My experience, and this is not well known, is that at my boarding school, I had to be in the combined cadet corps of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Well, it was really just the Army, to be honest. And I was taught every Tuesday afternoon how to fire a 1943 Lend-Lease rifle
Wow.
given by the United States to the British, a 2.2 rifle, and I had to pass the Empire test, which was a basic competency in firing this rifle. I then went on to learn how to fire self-loading rifles. I found the experience really distasteful, but to this day, I can still feel the process that is sort of ingrained in my brain in how to do that.
Yeah.
So at a very young age, I was made to be familiarize myself with guns, and I've never really thought of them in any other way after that as something I've done. I've gone through the ritual. That's it. I'm done. I've had enough. What was it like for you?
Well, I mean, at that age, it felt, honestly, it was, for me, it was, and this is the other interesting bit about the conversation, is that it wasn't a legal gun. He wasn't meant to have that gun. I mean, when you look back in retrospect, you realize guns are not, when you get older, there's a lot of things that you see. For example, even just the imbibing as a kid, you realize, I don't think we're meant to touch that gun. Because when I look at it, I remember it was never in the presence of my parents. We never had, and there was also this sort of loyalty and sort of secrecy when you hung out with your uncles, is that the things you did with your uncles, you were meant to enjoy. They were meant to be things your father will never allow you to do, and you never spoke about them to the immediate family. You kept them as memories, and it was like a way of my uncle sort of trying to show me that he was the coolest uncle. He was like the uncle that made me touch a gun. And so it was actually a handmade gun, a homemade gun, that when I think about it, and it's so interesting that I've thought about it at this moment, and it makes me question what he did with a gun, and what he used the gun for, to be able to get around life. And it's very clear and obvious that he definitely did something illegal with a gun. And so it's when I look at it now, it makes me realize, wow, just how we're introduced to things that sort of elevate or amplify our masculinity, but then also that can have a prolonged and profound effect on us as human beings, regardless of the idea of masculinity. And I think that's, for me, those are the things and the conversations that are important for us to have, is that no matter what, these extra things that we are seeding in the lives of young men, how risque and risky that they look, and how much they elevate their dominance and their feeling and their manlyhood, that they have a profound and sometimes completely negative effect on who they are as young adults and as men. Because if I did take up the gun after that experience, me being in a jail cell or even ending up dead, and remember, I come from the ghetto, I come from the slum, and I know enough young men, enough men who are my peers and my age mates, who are not alive, who are in cells, who are drug addicts, who are completely fallen off the bandwagon, the wagon. But now, it is because of someone adding something that would elevate their experience as men and cement their dominance, their masculinity dominance, but has subtracted and taken away their privilege to be with other normal people. And so when I look at it and say, wow, that was quite profound what he introduced to me, but it would have had a really bad effect in my life. And the only other time that I've been able to touch a gun, for example, is quite recently when I went to a shooting range, and I think for me it was really to be able to relieve. Interesting was to be able to relieve that experience with my uncle. But then now it was actually with a peer who was like, he goes to the shooting range and just holding the gun and shooting and knowing that that certain class of people, for example, in my country, when you have certain bank balance, you can be able to apply and get a gun, and just seeing the power that small, it was a pistol, that small thing has, and how it can put people into submission, and how it can take away life, and what it can do. I mean, it's ridiculous. One of my really interesting songs, music videos that I shot and has it's a sort of a short film of sorts. It's called Slow Down, and it's interesting because of seeing the experience and the of young people that I grew up with, and some who completely fell off the face of the earth. And the reason why the song is called Slow Down is because it depicts the story of myself as a young kid. I didn't want to put anybody on the out there, so it shows the life. It depicts my life as a young kid and how I am a great footballer, but football is not making ends meet. And so I'm introduced to the gun, and as a means for me to be able to, put food on the table. And during one of our heists, we actually caught because we rob a supermarket and we don't have an exit route. And we're arrested, we surrender to the police, and we end up in jail. And now it shows me sort of looking back at my life as a musician, and to the point where I am, because I didn't kill, but robbery with violence in Kenya is the punishment is rooted in colonialism, because the punishment, remember, if when black people Kenyans would steal from the white, from the British, and the punishment would be severe. It would actually be death by hanging. And so now I'm in jail, and I'm looking back, and there's some presidential leniency, and I'm able to leave jail. But the story really is able to captures the essence of how our dreams are stolen from us as young kids when violence, is added into the conversation, the equation of when we try to just put food on the table for us as young men. But how violence literally takes away from the young men so violently, and through the power of the gun. And so for me, that conversation around the gun is so interesting, because I know enough men, young men, whose lives have been destroyed because of trying to act more manlier or too manly. And I know the effect that it can have in their lives.
Yeah. The gun as an expression of dominance. I completely agree.
Yeah.
I wanted to, as we wrap up this episode, and there's a whole lot of other things we need to get really into detail on, from food to IQ versus emotional intelligence, from what it means to be a breadwinner. But I wanted to just end, I hope on a positive note, on our experiences of interacting with women and how women have, to the extent women have played a role in defining a positive sense of masculinity for us. Do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I sort of growing up and the stories that I would hear and even see for myself and experience, like I said, so my sort of experience as a man, and from a young boy, from a child to a young boy to a man, I've been lucky enough that in my culture, in Kikuyu culture, because where my dad was born, what I was lucky again to have my grandparents around, is that what they do is that once they mature, they just move out of the home and begin to build their own home in the same compound with my grandfather, which meant that I have been able to have an experience, of course, with my mom, with my grandmother, with my aunties, but also with my when I talk about my aunties here, I'm also not talking about just not only my paternal aunties, but also aunties who've been married into my family. And so I've been privy to see, and maybe it's my own lived experience, but even from my culture, you will hear from my tribe, the women from my tribe are so powerful. And by powerful, I really mean how they carry themselves, how they speak, how they fight for themselves, how they control their home. There's a myth told about women from my tribe, and they were so powerful, and even in stature, in how they carried themselves, in how they ruled the homestead and the home and the villages, that the men came up with a plan to impregnate all the women at one go so that they could have them pregnant and finally take the reins. There's a very interesting sort of cultural behavior that women have when, for example, they are rallying men to fight for something, or to, for example, fight the government of the day to get women to get their children, for example, out of prison. And so women, for example, were known, for example, to hoist up their outfits and show off their nakedness as a sign of not only disrespect but challenge the men, that if they're not willing to fight for their right or fight for what, just whatever they stood for, that the men should take up the women's skirts and the women would take up their trousers, and they would do that which the men were unable to fulfill. And so that is the sort of the community that I grew up in, and seeing women who are honestly completely very powerful. And so we are known from my tribe as being very matriarchal. We also have women in my tribe who, when they raise their sons on their own without the presence of the father, whether he evaded his responsibilities, or he just wasn't there, or died. And you'll find a lot of men in my community whose second name, they're actually named after their mother, which is completely unheard of in our cultures. And the men carry that name with a lot of pride. And so for me, that sort of shows you that my existence and my lived reality with women, I've seen a lot. Yes, there is the man, there is the dominance that comes to the men, but there is a lot of respect that we must accord our women. There's a lot of equity and equality that comes with the existence of women. And where that is denied for them, I have seen the women fight to get their place and really force themselves in that equation. And so for me, it's been a very interesting sort of reality to see how women take up responsibility, take up the dominance, take up their place in society with regard to equality and equity for themselves. And I've grown up knowing that, it's okay for women to be that powerful. And so I am completely support, and some people will call me, a modern day feminist. I don't know about that, but I completely respect their place in society.
Well, what a great way to end this episode, Anto. I mean, I feel we've just skimmed the surface.
Yeah, but you can't go. I have to hear about your relationship and experience with the women in life.
We'll save that. We'll save that for the next one. But what I will say is that you've touched on something that deeply, deeply resonates with me, and that is the experiences of matriarchal societies and societies where women are pushing for leadership roles in very many different ways, as experienced in different communities and tribes in Kenya, as seen in the different communities in Nigeria and, of course, in South Africa as well, really across the continent. That's a place where we can start learning and where we can use women influencers as part of our journey in creating and developing the 21st century man. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful to you for raising that.
Yeah, thank you.
So
thank you for having this. I feel like this conversation it's very, it's timely, and I'm so glad that you are taking, the reins in having this conversation and steering us. And I really can't wait for us to have more of these conversations. They're very, very timely. Thank you for making this happen.
No, thank you to you as well. And consider this sort of jointly holding the reins on this.
Yeah.
Well, Anto, we'll be back to go into these issues in more detail. But meanwhile, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Take good care.
Thank you for having me, and just be a man about it.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thank you so much to Anton NeoSoul. Thanks also to Eric Espera, our producer and director from Newsdoc Media. And finally, a big thanks to you. You can find us, of course, on every podcast platform there is. And don't forget to check out our YouTube channel. Give us 5 stars and subscribe and like us. Have a great week and a safe week, everyone.